renewables. It's pretty obvious to most people these days that climate change is, as we might call it, because of climate change seems too mild a term for really what's going to be coming. And this is really seen by most international bodies as the kind of biggest threat to mankind in coming years. So the biggest economic threat, the biggest threat to human health, biggest threat to global security, and that's not to mention the 200 animal species that go extinct every single day due to biodiversity loss and climate change. So for Ireland specifically, climate change is not going to hit homogeneously across the world. Different places are going to be hit in different ways. A 1.5 degree increase on average sounds pretty mild, but for Ireland that's going to be about a 3 to 4 degree increase is what the predictions probably say. And what's that going to mean in real time is we're going to see the whole country being absolutely destroyed by flooding, extreme flooding events like the ones that we've seen in recent years. This year, Ireland had the wettest February in 150 years. And globally, 9 of the 10 hottest years out of the last 100 years have been in the last 10 years. So that is, unless, of course, the Gulf Stream that we depend upon for our temperate weather gets interrupted, in which case the temperature in Ireland is going to absolutely plummet and will be in a much, much harsher environment altogether. For Portugal, it's not going to see the same kind of effects. Probably going to see a lot more drought, dryness, and exacerbation of the kind of extreme weather events that they've had to face there in the past. So then, why target the built environment is the real question. So CO2 is the main greenhouse gas emission, which is of course the biggest driver of climate change. And the built environment is responsible for, in total, we can see about 40% of all CO2 emissions. Now, out of that, there is a significant component that is made up of the embodied carbon. That's how the energy that's emitted when we actually construct buildings. But most of it is actually from the operational emissions of the building. So what we use to keep the building running. So that's what I'm going to be talking about today, though the embodied carbon is also significant. So then we're looking at like what impact renewables can actually have on this problem. So the most important thing is a huge reduction in those operational emissions. And in terms of the kind of macro sense of the problem, that is really what we're trying to do. But we also want it to be, positive for all of the players who are involved. So what else can it do? The owners and occupiers of buildings, it can mean really, really significant savings on their energy bills, be that electricity or replacement of gas, or if they're currently using fossil fuels like oil and stuff, replacing those. It's typically a lot cheaper to do that through renewables. You're getting your green credentials, which is obviously helping the PR case for your business. You're protecting against the future increase in energy prices. And the last point that I have there, participation in energy markets. So what I essentially mean by that is when we input renewable energy, we don't always control the way that it produces power. And sometimes there's a mismatch between production and consumption. So what's really, really important there is that we'll then be exporting that energy to the main grid usually. And that means we're now a player in that energy market. So for big users or anything like that, when feed-in tariffs come in, that's going to be significant revenue streams, and kind of seeing how we're buying and selling power is going to be really, really affected by renewable energy. So the next question then is just how we go about doing this. What technologies are there to implement these changes? So there are really a lot of different kinds of renewable energies. But for the ones that are suitable for the built environment, we basically have geothermal, biomass and its products, and solar power. Before we dive into those, a lot of people will go, well, what about wind energy? And to that, wind energy is a really, really fantastic technology. It's doing great things to decarbonize the global electricity grids, but with the scale that it operates at, the technology and the economics don't really work for built environment specific installations of renewable energy. Likewise for a couple of other things such as like hydropower and things like that. So essentially we have geothermal, which we're going to be talking about primarily through about heat pumps. There's also the possibility of vertical geothermal boards, but they're very, very case specific. So I'm not going to dive too deeply into those. Biomass and its products, which as this can be the replacement of gas, of diesel, of petrol, or of other things essentially. And then solar power, which we're mostly quite familiar with. So let's start with heat pumps. What is a heat pump? Because to a lot of people, it's just a random buzzword being thrown around a lot these days, or you might not have heard it at all. So essentially, what a heat pump is kind of like an inside-out fridge. So imagine a fridge that we're just running backwards, where our house is the inside of the fridge, or our building of any kind, and we're just pumping, instead of pumping the heat outwards as they do in a fridge, we're just using electricity to pump the heat from outside in. So what that means is that a heat pump by itself is actually a very, very high efficiency heating device. It's not strictly a renewable energy device, and it's not actually completely sustainable unless the heat pump itself is being supplied with renewable electricity. So we basically have four kinds of heat pumps. There's a ground to air heat pump, which is the heat is coming from a ground source, a water to air, an air to air, or an air to water heat pump. So the first three are all heating they're all giving you space heating within a building, and the last one's giving you water heating. So the flexibility of heat pumps makes them really, really powerful devices, because you can supply both heating and cooling. You can just reverse the cycle, so it's acting like a real fridge. They have been around for a really long time. In Ireland, not so much. The market penetration hasn't been there an enormous amount, but it's particularly in the southeast of Europe and northeast of Europe. Heat pumps are really, really widely proliferated, been around for a long time, and I wouldn't have any concerns about their effectiveness. As I mentioned, they're a high efficiency device, but they do require a source of power. So typically people are still mostly going with the air source heat pump. All of these are good devices compared to not having one, but there are significant differences between them. So the air source heat pump is by far the cheapest, and that's because of the installation costs. So for a ground source, you've got to do a lot of digging essentially. But a heat pump's efficiency is dependent on its the heat that the temperature of the heat source you're taking it from. For the air in winter, particularly in Ireland, that's quite cold typically. So you're having to work really, really hard to move that heat. Whereas the ground remains much warmer, so in your winter, your efficiency stays. I actually don't have figures about the ground temperatures in Portugal for comparison. Water sources can be a really, really nice mix of the two, where you have relatively low install cost and efficiencies close to those of the ground source, but they're very, very site dependent. So it's dependent on you being close enough to a stable body of water that's not going to be impacted by you messing with its temperature very much. So then water heating pumps, because we have to raise the internal body of water to a much higher temperature than we typically need for space heating, they're lower efficiency than air heating for space heating heat pumps. However, they might have advantages because your tank of water then will stay hot for a long time. So if you can use those to heat your water, and you don't need to use the water straight away, whereas if you use space heating, obviously you can't kind of store it. Your building gets hot. So then moving on to the second option, which is biomass. So first of all, let's just have a look at this picture on the right. And I think that this is really, really interesting. It's kind of the main selling point, the story of biomass. So biomass is basically any biological matter. Here's a bunch of examples of it floating around here, from kind of animal waste and to actually human remains. I'm not quite so sure if that one would ever end up in being used in a bioreactor. but it is possible. And essentially, this shows that the flexibility and versatility of the idea of biofuels. So you're trying to use kind of waste products from different industries and streams and turn those into usable renewable energy. So primarily we have biomethane, biodiesel, bioalcohols, and traditional biomass, which is a wood chip or wood pellets. So let's just go through those quickly. Biomethane is upgraded biogas. So most commonly, this is when you take cattle manure or some other kind of manure, and you go through a process called anaerobic respiration in a bioreactor, which essentially when it breaks down without oxygen. That releases methane. It also releases a bunch of other chemicals which aren't so good to burn. So you have to kind of clean it or upgrade it, and then you get biomethane. Now that's chemically indistinguishable from natural gas. In fact, it can have higher purities than natural gas. So it can be completely interchanged into a natural gas burning facility of any kind. Then we have biodiesel, which is kind of obviously a diesel replacement. This is made through transesterification of fats and oils, usually called HVO. Now, this differs from biomethane in that it is technologically mature, but you never end up with such a clean product. So at the moment, this can only be blended to a maximum of about 10 or 15% purity without affecting the engine quality itself. So I would say that it's kind of only an option where there's no other option but to continue using the diesel engine, and you just want to green it up a little bit. Then there are bioalcohols. So the typical one is bioethanol. We're all much more familiar with the process of making this because it's the fermentation process, which is the same for making all alcohol. In fact, the term bioalcohols is maybe a bit of a misnomer because all alcohols are bioalcohols in a way. And this is commonly used throughout the world's petrol pumps, actually. So it's blended in there as a petrol replacement. This is a really, really high purity product. So again, it's kind of like the biomethane in that you can put it in there without affecting the engine integrity. And then the last one, as I said, the traditional biomass. It's actually an enormous amount of the kind of renewable energy use across the world is burning traditional biomass. So what we're doing here is direct burning of hopefully waste products. So really the source is super important here. If you're taking the waste product from a building site, say there's a big timber frame building and that goes into a wood chipper and goes to become traditional biomass, that's really, really good because you're getting a second life out of those things and replacing fossil fuels. Whereas if we're cutting down heritage forest in order to make wood chip, that's not so good. We don't want to be doing that. So the important thing about biomass that a lot of people don't really understand is the idea of carbon neutrality, because for a lot of people, they'll look at this and they'll go, okay, we're still burning something and we're still emitting CO2 when we do. How is this helpful? How is this better than fossil fuels? And the key thing to take away is the source. The source is what's really important. So for fossil fuels initially all started as plants themselves, and they sequestered carbon from the atmosphere when they grew. They went under the earth and they stored it in fossil fuels millions of years ago. So the problem is that when we burn fossil fuels, we're restoring the carbon level towards what it was like millions of years ago and adding carbon to the entire cycle. And millions of years ago, the earth was in a state that we couldn't possibly live in now. But for biomass, typically that carbon has been sequestered in the last, say, 2 to 50 years. So by burning that, we're not affecting the cycle. And additionally, we can replace it with more plants that will sequester the carbon again. So it's not a problem. The net carbon emission from biomass is zero. I say that it's not exactly zero because obviously there are emissions associated with transporting and processing, etc., but very close to zero. As I said before, the source of the biomass is really a crucial environmental factor. Some other examples of a poor source of biomass would be palm oil from destroying kind of Brazilian rainforest to make palm oil plantations. That's not good. But again, if the source is good, it's really, really good. Whether biomass is suitable is really highly dependent on what you're doing at the moment. So if you currently have a completely electrified, say, heating and transport system, obviously I would never recommend putting in something that's compatible for biomass. But say you have something that's a gas burner and you want to just make that greener, then replacing that with biogas is a really good option for that. And you don't have the kind of embodied emissions of putting in a new system as well. Again, so what we said here, when electrification is not possible, it's a really, really good solution. In Ireland, the industry is still immature, and as far as I know, that's the same story in Portugal. I'm not entirely sure about that. We have low production volumes and people are not aware of it as a solution. So to a lot of people, it sounds complicated, it sounds strange, and they're not kind of sold on the idea of biomass. So just to give you an example of how low our production volumes are, we currently have 12 production facilities for biomethane, compared to across Germany, it's about 7,000, I think. So that's the kind of scales that we're looking at there. But it's going to be growing, and there's a kind of a lot of really good biomass business networks like this one that are growing up specifically to target those things. So then to move on to solar power, which a lot of people are more familiar with, but it's actually quite misunderstood for a lot of people. It is the obvious fit for the built environment because we all kind of typically have underused roof space. And it is very technologically mature. So the first solar panels were built 60 years ago, and since then they've gotten more robust, they've gotten better at doing what they do, and really importantly, much cheaper as well. So this is I think, important graph to illustrate solar power capacity in Ireland. So obviously your solar panels of any kind are going to function better with higher solar irradiance. And we can see here that on average, Ireland has much better solar irradiance than the UK, actually. But as of the end of last year, we had 25 megawatts of solar capacity, which is not a lot, whereas the UK had 13,000. So despite the fact that we have a better resource, even proportionally to the difference in our populations, they're using about 500 times more solar power than we are. So there are basically two kinds of solar power. So the first one is solar thermal. You've probably seen these a lot, particularly about 10 years ago. In Portugal, they have a different kind of solar thermal. Typically, it's just the big silver tank that you see on a lot of people's roofs. In southern, hotter climates, that's appropriate, whereas in northern, colder climates with more diffuse sunlight, you have to have these evacuated tubes. So what they're doing basically is converting the sun's rays directly into water heating, and that just gets piped straight into your house. It is a really economic solution for water supply because their conversion efficiency of these, particularly when they're new, is super high. 70% of all the energy that's falling onto an evacuated tube, solar thermal, goes to heat, which is an incredible conversion efficiency. We're seeing a lot less of these in recent years, and that's mostly because solar PV is kind of competing for market share and for direct roof space, and solar PV has gotten so much cheaper, so people are opting for PV instead of solar thermal. I would say solar thermal is still a really good option where there is high hot water demand, which realistically is most buildings. There is some operation and maintenance required. And every 5 to 10 years, you have to replace the fluid within these evacuated tubes. And for the kind of solid silver ones that we see in southern latitudes, that isn't required. So that's an advantage for those. Then to move on to the other option of solar energy, solar power, which is rooftop PV. Well, solar PV, which can be rooftop, as we see in the example here, is actually an installation that KRA Renewables managed, or a solar PV facade. So obviously the advantage to the rooftop is that it's a simple and quick install, and it's using space that you wouldn't use for anything else. The advantage to a facade is that, as I see it, facades are already very expensive, and the difference in cost between a regular facade and a solar facade is actually quite small proportionally. Then it's also producing power for you, and a factor that isn't really given a lot of consideration is that it's very visible. So your rooftop PV typically can't be seen by your customers or anyone that you work with, whereas a solar facade is very, very visible front and center, and displays your green company image well. So how does it work? We won't go too deep into the kind of physics of this because it can get quite complicated. But essentially you have a special type of junction in here. It's called a PN junction. Solar energy falls in onto these cells. You typically have 60 or 72 of these cells making up your solar module. The solar energy falls in, it liberates an electron from the back contact, which goes up to the top, gets carried away by the circuitry, and then is electricity. So that's a very, very quick description of quite a complicated technology. So the idea of solar is that it's very, very modular. So you put together a bunch of these cells that make a module, a bunch of the modules that make a string, and a bunch of the strings that make your system. So what does a typical layout of that kind of system look like? All right, so a very, very simple layout. We have sunlight falling on our PV. Our PV produces DC, or direct current electricity. And now that's all well and good because it's more efficient to do it that way. But our actual devices in our house expect AC electricity because that's what we get from the grid. So it has to go through another component called an inverter. If we want to use batteries along with this, we need a hybrid inverter. So it goes to the hybrid inverter, which can exchange power with your battery bank, giving it in or taking it back. It supplies all your AC loads. That's any devices in a building, from residential washing machines to, say, a big electrical heating system or something like that, or supplying your heat pumps, etc. Any excess goes to your meter and to the grid, and if you're using more than you're producing, you just take it from the grid. So it's important to note that putting in these PV panels is, and this system in general, is never going to affect your ability to use power. It might affect your choices a bit when you use power, but it's not going to affect your ability to do so. So it's not going to interrupt your work. So as we said, it's very modular. We put together strings of modules, and we have up to 2 strings can be connected once to an inverter. A string is just what it sounds like. It's just a big line of modules connected in series. We can design a system to any size, and when I say that, I mean any size. A PV system can hypothetically be as small as 5 watts, which is not enough to power a light bulb, all the way up past the gigawatt range. You know, you could supply Ireland with a single PV system, hypothetically. The module efficiency is constantly growing with time, and the current market average is around 17 to 19%. So some people look at that and they go, that seems terrible. That's so low. I'm losing, say, 80% of the energy. And I would say, technically that's true, but that's actually not that important, because what matters is the cost of per unit of energy that you actually get compared to how much the technology cost. So 17 to 19% doesn't seem that great, but when you think that the most efficient actual power plants in the world are only about 40%, you go, okay, well, efficiency is a complicated story. So 17 to 19% is not actually too bad. There are modules with lower efficiency than this. They're a lot cheaper. I would say it's not really worthwhile going for those, just because the efficiency drop means quite a lot of difference in power. And then there are modules that are significantly higher efficiency than this, up to about 23, 24%. But the cost of those is currently so high that it's not worth the extra cost to go for those. So let's say this is kind of the sweet spot. And we produce a super high quality energy, which is electricity. Electricity is obviously fantastic because of its versatility. We can do a lot of different stuff with electricity, and we can at any time convert electricity, say, to heat, whereas converting heat back to electricity is complicated, and we can't usually do that. So as we mentioned before, you can put this in tandem with the battery system. So that's basically to spread out your supply time. And that means that you can use green energy even when you're not producing it. Batteries are quite expensive though. So a more economic solution might be to use what's called a diversion controller. This essentially takes any excess that you're not using at any one time and sends it to heat your, say, hot water tank, or say an immersion heater or something like that. Basically, the most economic way to use a PV system is self-using and preventing grid spillage. This is doubly the case in Ireland, where we do not currently have a feed-in tariff. It's expected to come in this year, but with the whole COVID crisis and everything, it could be 2021 or maybe even 22. Now, it is important to say that there are a lot of things that affect how much your PV system is actually going to output in terms of its energy yield. And those include the tilt, the orientation, the shading, the string layout, as well as your choice of components and how they're combined together and all that kind of stuff. So having someone who knows what they're doing involved is really, really important. I would say that for the case of, your domestics, where it's just kind of a very short amount of modules going on a roof, a local installer is fine. But if you're looking at a big commercial building, I wouldn't just go with your Joe Soap electrician who's retrained rather as a solar installer. Rather get a renewable energy engineer involved. They'll really, the cost of having them involved will really, really be worth it for the additional energy yield and robustness that you get out of the system. It is important to say not all systems are equal. So if you put a system up on the roof in the wrong way or using the wrong components, you could have enormous drops in output compared to what you're expecting. You could have, it's a very safe technology, but if it was installed incorrectly, there are problems, of course, that could happen. Which include, for example, affecting the building integrity. So you don't want to put modules onto a roof where, say, the roof can't hold it or something like that, or placing PV modules right underneath a chimney stack where the shading of the chimney is going to affect the PV modules, because that will affect the production of the entire PV strings and therefore the whole system. So yeah, not all systems are equal. As I said, there's a lot of components available. It's quite a flooded market now, and there are, I think it's fair to say, thousands of producers of PV modules. A lot of different guides out there to different kinds of ones. But a lot of people, when they're quoting a system, will say, our modules are tier 1 modules, and therefore most people assume that is a quality mark of the modules. That's actually not what tier 1 means. Tier 1 is a financial metric about the producers of the modules. So it's actually made by Bloomberg, and it's not a statement about the actual quality of the modules themselves. Generally, all tier 1 modules are good quality modules, but there are many, many good quality modules or premium modules, like the kind of best performers in the market, that are not actually tier 1 because they don't satisfy the specific criteria for the Bloomberg tier 1 list. Good systems have a 30+ year lifetime. That is really, really important. Most people just let that sink in for a second, that when you put this system up, it will still be producing 80% of its day 1 power after 30 years, which is really, really phenomenal, I would expect, right? How does that compare to almost any other installation of power producing equipment? Like it's on a whole other scale. And if you don't buy that, as I said, the very first PV module was made 60 years ago, and it's still working. So their production process has only gotten better with time. Yeah, so I would say 30+ years is a bare minimum. there could be failures before that time, but mostly that's because of some kind of accident or incident, you know, somebody lobbing rocks, big heavy rocks at your PV system. Obviously it's not going to be still working, but yeah, all else considered, it should have 30 plus years. That's for the PV modules themselves. In that time, as I said, you're going to have an inverter in your system, and your inverter will not last 30 years. You'd be very lucky to have your inverter last 30 years. Typically, they last somewhere between 7 and 15 years. I would say it's very worth the money up front to buy a market-leading inverter, because they're the most likely point of failure. So in my mind, I want to replace my inverter on average once throughout the lifetime of the system, not 4 times. So I'm going to spend the money the first time around to get a fancy inverter. What can your PV system do? Well, it's going to be able to give us a really significant proportion of the building's energy needs. People say, well, how much? And I say, how long is a piece of string? But ballpark 40 to 60%, with many, many, many other factors bringing that number above or below that. But yeah, that's with where it's supplying almost all of your electricity in the summertime and much, much less in the wintertime when we've got those shorter days. As I said, the most economic way is to self-consume, so you can optimize that by kind of changing the times that power is produced by changing your array layout, or changing the times that you consume power in order to match the production power, profile of your system. They do need a small amount of O&M each year. Technically, you could go without this, but it's not very much. There is kind of a gap in the market, certainly in Ireland, for O&M companies at the moment. So I'd say that when kind of dedicated heating and O&M PV companies come out, those costs could shrink more. I'm not entirely sure, but it's on the order of a couple of €100 every year, which compared to, for a big commercial system, say a 50 to 100,000 euro investment, it's well worth it in order to keep it functioning optimally. You know, you wouldn't buy a fancy car and then never take it to the mechanic. So then, how does it kind of work economically? Hopefully I'm doing all right on time, not going over too much. So economically, we can see that PV is really, really coming down in price. And that's basically coming from the fact that we're just producing a lot more modules and we're getting better at knowing how to do it around the world. So let's just take a look closer at this graph. The units on this side don't really matter. This is from an English study, but what I just want you to look at is the trend. So over the last 60 years, we've seen the price of PV modules coming down 99%, but let's just take this 10-year period for comparison. So this is the actual modules themselves. So you can see that they've really, really come down more than about 60, 70% in that time. And then the entire system price, which includes, you know, your inverters and actually the install costs as well, has come down very, very rapidly as well. And we can see in these years, that was kind of when a lot of new players were coming into global markets and we're getting better at doing installs, so it got a lot cheaper. And then the rest of that, it's kind of just following the decrease in module cost. I'd say it's pretty important to note here that we're kind of getting close to the cheapest that it can be, because if this module cost even drops to absolutely zero, you're still going to have this gap, which is based on, you know, the people actually going in, putting in the time, going up onto the roof, etc. And that can't really be squeezed any further. So takeaways from this are that PV is now incredibly, incredibly cheap, and that it's not going to get much cheaper. So now is a really, really good time to buy, particularly because governments are still offering subsidies and stuff for PV across most of the world of one form or another, but the cost is not going to decrease any further. So now might be the best time possible to buy a PV system. I'm focusing on the economics of PV here, particularly. Obviously, all of the renewable technologies have their own economics, but we don't have 4 or 5 hours to go through each one of them one after another. So I'm just going to focus on solar PV. So it really depends on how much your current cost of grid energy is and how much of it you currently use. or how short your kind of payback period for this kind of thing is. With grant assistance of maybe 20 to 30%, and a really, really well-designed, optimized system where you're not being ripped off by anybody, you could have phenomenal metrics financially. So you could have a 3 to 4 payback, and that, remember, that's on a 30 to 50 year investment, with a 25% plus internal rate of return. For any accountants or anything out there, that pricked up my ears first time I heard that. And even without grant support of any kind, that's looking at kind of 6 to 10 years for the payback, and an IRR again that could be above 15%, which is still very strong. So then, how does it work? How do renewable technologies work together? The first one, I alluded to this earlier, is solar PV and heat pumps. So if you want to make your heat pump go from a high efficiency device to a true renewable heating device, you can supply it with power from your PV. Now, that's super, super important because particularly in Northern Europe, we're doing quite well at greening our electrical systems, but we're doing terribly at greening heat. So this is a really, really good way to green the heat usage in a building. And it is kind of a holistic approach to energy. You're starting to look at your entire energy system together, and that gives enormous savings. So you're getting savings across your electricity usage and against whatever your previous heating system was. So then what if a heat pump is not appropriate? So for example, your space might be just too small to warrant the capital cost of a heat pump, or maybe you have a kind of warehouse building or something like that where the doors are getting opened all the time and you don't want that heat to just be rushing out. Well, you can combine solar PV with infrared heating panels. So the big difference here is the efficiency is not nearly as high. Heat pumps are the highest efficiency possible, but they actually they heat irradiatively, which means that they're not heating air like convection, they heat surfaces. So if you've got big airflow there where it's carrying out all the heat in the air, the room will still stay quite warm. So that's a good solution for that. And also this is a solution that gives really, really unparalleled thermal comfort. So if that's something that a building occupier cares about a lot, which is obviously important to most of us, then this is a really, really nice way to green heat. As I will stress though, it's not quite as efficient as a heat pump. So then just the combination of solar PV and solar thermal. Solar PV really, really doesn't like shading. You can't put it up anywhere that's going to be shaded really at all. There are ways to mitigate that problem that I don't have time to jump into. But if you have a roof where there's a lot of it partially shaded, you can put your solar thermal there because the solar thermal doesn't really care about shading so much. And you can put the solar PV in a really nice clear spot. And you're still going to get quite a good yield of hot water out of your solar thermal, and it's not going to mess with your PV system for electricity production. So then what about transport, which is something that the other area that's super, super important to green that we haven't touched upon yet. And that is where the combination of solar PV and EV chargers comes in. Now, this is a super, super interesting area because it helps us to truly green transport. Anybody who has an electrical vehicle probably knows that EVs are always greener than their petrol counterparts, but they still do have potentially relatively high emissions if the grid energy that they're using has high emissions. So if you supply those with green energy that you've produced directly from PV, then you're truly greening transport. Also, this is possibly the most economic way that you could use your PV energy, because the product of electricity to supply EVs is typically sold around 30 cents per kilowatt hour from the grid, and it's only costing you say 6 cents to produce it or less. So that's an incredibly high value product, and if you can sell that say in a public car park or something like that, you could really make a lot of money. You could be onto a winner here. Obviously it's very dependent on the project. Also, it's a way to reduce your grid export if you want to avoid giving money to the grid for free, and it is really high visibility. So they may not see, as we said, the PV on your roof, but they're going to be able to see the EV chargers in front, and they're going to think, wow, that company cares a lot. Sorry if I'm speaking too quickly for anybody here. Just trying to get through all of my slides. So the last option that I'm going to talk about is a combined heat and power system, or CHP, and biogas or biomass. So essentially, in your typical power station, what you have is you're giving it fuel, and it has, as we mentioned earlier, about 40% efficiency. So 40% of that energy comes out to electricity into the grid, and 60% is wasted as heat. So a CHP is like a tiny power station that you put into your building. Really, really good for large commercial buildings, hotels, things like that. High electricity and high heating demand. So even if you're running them from fossil fuels, by the fact that we're not wasting all of that heat energy, we're already making huge, huge carbon savings compared to just using grid resources. And if we replace the source of that CHP's fuel with either biogas or traditional biomass, then we can completely green transport and heat together in a really, really efficient way. So I think that in about 5 to 10 years, this is going to be a combination that we see a lot of across Europe. That's all on technologies, economics, and some synergies, and I'm just going to round out with a couple of myths. So here's a few nonsense statements that I've heard about renewable energy that I'm just going to debunk for you now. So renewable technologies never pay back their embodied energies. Basically, any time that we make anything, it takes energy to do that. That's really important, and we should think about the embodied energy of everything before we purchase things. And some people like to think that renewable technologies take more energy to make than they produce. True at all. For solar PV, for example, they typically produce the energy that it took to make them in 1.5 years out of a 30+ year lifetime. And then for, say, a more grid or utility scale solution, commercial wind farms typically pay back their embodied energy within 6 months. So it's just not true at all. The next myth is that renewables need government support to be economically worthwhile, which kind of implies that they're costing the entire country. This might have been true 10 or 15 years ago. From the kind of graphs that we looked at before, it's very not true today. So we all like having grants, we all like having support, and we like it making the capital costs cheaper, but it's actually not required to make these worthwhile investments. I'd say that one's definitely not in the vast majority of cases. And then the last one, which is one of the most infuriating ones, is renewables can't replace fossil fuels. So the argument here is basically that the sun doesn't always shine, the wind doesn't always blow, and so in those downtimes, we're always going to have fossil fuels. I'm just going to tell a very quick kind of anecdote to address this, which is that in, say, the 60s and 70s, when these technologies were really coming into being, people were saying that renewable technologies would never supply more than 1 to 3% of grid electricity. Then in the 80s, they were saying, like 5%, and then over time, they were saying, okay, it'll never supply more than 10%, it'll never supply more than 15%. Last year in Ireland, wind energy alone supplied 30% of Ireland's electricity need every year. And so far this year, in January and February at least, that's when I last looked at the statistics, it supplied 50%. So now, a week ago, I read an article saying renewable energy will never supply more than 80% of our needs. I say, okay, well, it's the exact same story. It's true that the wind doesn't always blow, the sun doesn't always shine, but we have other solutions, storage solutions to spread those profiles out. And with products like biomass, where you don't have to be producing at the same time as you're consuming, we can supply the downtime between those. So I think that one is also very, very fair and will be shown. So the last thing, I'm just going to talk about what we actually do in KRA Renewables. So we're independent renewable energy consultants, specifically for the built environment. We take a project from when somebody's first considering it, all the way through in every stage, managing it, all the way to post-completion reports on how the project is doing. We completely avoid cut and paste solutions. So we tailor each project to the client's needs, which is pretty important because every building is different and every client's demands are different. And our sister company, KRA Visionary Project Partners, has 20 years experience in the built environment. So through consultation with that second company, we ensure that renewable energy solutions are only going to add value to a building and won't compromise the integrity of the building fabric. So thank you so much for your attention. I hope that that was all understandable. And that's my presentation for the day. So I believe we have some question time built in, Arnold.
Yeah, thank you very much, Finn. Was really interesting. Lots of information. Sometimes a bit too tough for me, but.
Sorry, I don't know if it's the connection. I'm just struggling to hear you a little bit there.
It was very interesting. Sorry. So, anybody has any questions? I wanted to ask you, Finnbar, about the solar power.
Yeah.
You were saying that, and I hope that people can hear me. You were saying that in Ireland, the use of the solar power is very much less than in the UK, although the propensity to use it is. You were saying that in Ireland, the solar power compared to the UK is much lower.
Yeah.
500 to 1, I think. And I was curious to know how do you explain that?
Basically, the UK has government support schemes in place. So they had them for a really, really long time on a kind of low-level micro-generation sense. They introduced those, I think, 10 or 12 years ago, and they really, really gave a lot of support to those people. But actually, the really big difference is on the utility scale. So they have a lot of large solar plants, and at the moment, Ireland has 0. We have no utility scale solar plants. We have no solar farms whatsoever. The very first solar farms are going to be coming in this year, hopefully. There's actually a really, really nice community-based organization in Ireland called Community Power, and they're going to be participating in the energy auction in June, the RESS, for 3 different solar farms. But the really important thing about those, I think, is that they're open to investment from anybody. So a share in those costs €1,000, and they then pay out dividends every year based on those shares. So if you're interested in participating in those, I can send a link to Community Power to have a look at those. But essentially, that's the difference, is that we have no utility scale solar farms, primarily because the government has made it difficult to obtain planning permission and grid connection for those farms.
Okay. Thank you.
Hi, Finnbar. That was really interesting. I'm not a commercial property owner. However, I am a domestic property owner. I was really intrigued by what you were saying about the solar panels and the heat pumps. And am I right in saying that the heat pumps are really more for commercial use as opposed to domestic use?
No, actually, the heat pumps can be scaled. So you can have really small heat pumps as well as really big ones. I would say that a heat pump is not always an appropriate solution for a domestic building. Nice cat. But actually, heat pumps are a pretty good solution for the majority of buildings. I would say that a really crucial factor for heat pumps is how well insulated your house is. Because if you have a super sorry, Sharon, are you based in Ireland or in Portugal?
No, I'm actually in Portugal. Yeah.
Okay, so I don't know what the equivalent of the BER scheme is in Portugal, but essentially, if your house is well insulated, then a heat pump is going to be super efficient. If your house is poorly insulated, then that efficiency will drop, basically because, you know, you're cooling the space and then it will instantly heat up again, or heating the space and it's going to cool down again really quickly. And so you're just going to have to be running your heat pump a lot. But absolutely, no, it's definitely worth investigating.
Yeah, so so talk to an actual renewable engineer as opposed to a company who supplies just the heating panels themselves.
For a heat
Sharon,
pump,
you can talk to me because I will do it.
Great.
Well, Finnbar, I just has something to add to you. First of all, thank you for the presentation. It's great. It's excellent. In Portugal, there is two things that to consider. One of them is that we actually have more sunlight, so you can produce more. So it's more efficient. But in Portugal, what happened is that until I believe 2 years ago, we have to sell our energy to the company, and then we have to rebuy it. We cannot use it directly, and this is why there is not a big investment on residential units. So that's changed, and we are seeing, my phone just doesn't stop ringing, I'm sorry. And what we are seeing is that there is a lot of residential in Portugal that are trying to buy and to install them. On office buildings, on big installations is a little bit difficult because actually the payback is normally a problem, even though we don't have more sunlight, but we don't have the rent that support us as probably you have in Ireland. But it's obviously one of the big solutions that we are trying to implement on our buildings. And we work on both sides, on project management and facility management. So we try to integrate it on the project management, so it will be less expensive during the operation. But in residential units, like Sharon are talking about, typically in Portugal, you just choose between one of the two solutions and combine it with different options. So normally it's more cost efficient.
Okay, so yeah, I would say that absolutely, if you're not getting a good rate for your electricity when you're selling it, and you're buying at a high rate in comparison, then that could be a challenge for making the economics of a PV system work. Normally, you might kind of run the numbers and see we have a kind of modeling system to see what systems are going to be appropriate based on how much you're buying and selling the power, and it is kind of a complicated problem, more so than it might first appear. I would also just make two slight changes to the statement that you made. So you mentioned that in Portugal you've higher efficiency for solar PV. Technically, that's not actually true, because Portugal is a hotter country. The panel efficiency will actually drop there compared to northern latitude countries where it's colder. So in a colder environment, PV panels work more efficiently. The reason that you'll get much higher output from your panels, it's just that you have higher solar irradiance. So and potentially when you have longer hours, so in the winter you'll have longer daylight hours than in the summer. But for example, an Irish summer day, you might get higher production out of a PV system than a Portuguese summer day, based on the drop in efficiency that you get from the heat. So PV is a really, really fantastic technology. But if it's not working for you economically, I would say that, don't always jump for it. Solar thermal might always be a stronger option for you there, particularly because in the solar thermal case, you're not having to buy and sell the power, right? I mean, like they can't make you buy your heat from them, right? So putting solar thermal onto buildings to at least match the heating needs might be a stronger option. You can also get solar space heating and solar cooling. They do exist as technologies. They're not quite as technologically mature, and I personally haven't dealt with them except on paper. So I haven't dealt with them within a real project as of yet. But that might be a potential solution in the Portuguese environment to circumvent that need to buy and sell the power. So I don't know, did that answer your question, Pedro?
Yeah, Pedro, can I just step in? It's Christina here. We've spoken on other webinars. Am I right in thinking that you work in the municipality, or is it government?
No, I'm not. I don't. No, please don't. I don't want to work for them.
Okay. So
No, I work for a private company, and
okay.
what we do is project management and facility management. And
okay, very good.
In those areas, we always work with renewables, so we can try to be more efficient on the energy level. But the problem on solar panels in Portugal is also the payback is different, because the cost of energy here is probably lower than in Ireland. And the investors, especially the investors that we work, if they just own the building and they want to rent it, they doesn't care about the efficiency of the products. But when we are building a product for a user, we can input this and we can make difficult changes that it will be difficult for just a financial owner. But with the user is different. When we did the TV station in Portugal, the SIC television, there was a different problem, because they have so much energy. They need so much energy on the building, and we have so much redundancy on the building for every systems that it was almost impossible to input some efficient solutions, more efficient solutions. We need to provide the grid with power, with a lot of power, and that was not efficient with solar or any kind of different solution.
Okay, my other observation.
So, Finnbar, I just want to ask you. Do you have an idea the cost of the electric power in Ireland to comparison to Portugal?
Yeah, so it ranges from place to place. So for a domestic sense in Ireland, we're normally spending about 20 cents per kilowatt hour, which is very high. And then for commercial, it could be anything from about kind of 7, 8 cents, where it's very, very hard to make the economics work for you, all the way up to maybe 22 cents, where it's a gold mine. I don't know if you.
Yeah, that's the problem.
Yeah. So it very much does depend on, you know, do you know yourself kind of what price per kilowatt hour you're looking at for buildings?
I don't have it here, but the problem is that in Portugal we have cheaper energy. So because of the equipment is also more or less the same price, we have a payback, a longer payback, normally 8 to 10 years, and that is the problem. And if you had some doubts that probably the consumers have, it will make it difficult.
Sure, yeah. I mean, I understand that 8 to 10 years can put a lot of investors off in terms of a payback period. I would say that, you know, after those 8 to 10 years, you are just kind of getting an enormous amount of your power basically for free then. And one of the arguments that I would employ then to convince investors is about the increase to future energy prices. Because even if you assume that energy prices are going to just go up 2% per year, that's, sorry, just throw this into a calculator, 1.02 times 30. So that's actually, right? Yeah, so that's over that time, then you're looking at nearly 100% increase in those energy prices. So that means that by the end of the lifetime, with a 2% per year, year-on-year increase, the per unit cost that you're saving is doubled by the end of the life. And given that you're still producing 80% of the power at that time, I would say that partially it's kind of a protection against future uncertainties. You know, and like 2% is the predicted amount, but that's not taking into account any massive disruption to global trade. We have no idea, for example, how this current crisis and the massive impact on oil is going to affect global prices. You know, I think the most likely projections are for an immediate short-term drop in price of energy, followed by an enormous hike when a huge amount of the production facilities of oil and fossil fuels shut down. And that's actually good for renewables, because it means that in comparison, our renewable energy will be much cheaper. So there are going to be so many of these disruptive events coming from the actual impacts of climate change itself, that I see that the kind of energy security as being a real selling point for those investors who are hesitant about an 8 to 10 year payback. That's just my 2 cents on it. Hydra, did you get that? Have you frozen?
Yeah.
So maybe any other questions from anyone?
Maybe it has some issues.
Well, thank you, Finnbar. That was great. Really informative. I think everyone seems to be having a lot of internet difficulty this morning because you're all freezing at various points. So, but thank you. It was really informative. And Christina, I hope we'll see you maybe when we do the sustainability event in September, which we're still hoping to do in some other format now.
Yeah, absolutely. I came to the first one in Lisbon last year.
Yeah.
And that was great. Funnily enough, I bumped into my own local TD whose kids went to school with my kids at the event, which showed what a small and interconnected world we have. And yes, I'm definitely very interested in staying on board on that. So yes, and if anybody's got any questions on the, the broader issues around this, of course, just please contact either myself or Finnbar directly, and we're more than happy to talk about specific questions, specific buildings, and so on.
Absolutely, yeah. Or if you have any more, kind of technical questions that pop to mind at a later date, just feel free to drop me an email.
Yes,
Really
I will have
thank you.
later.
No problem.
I will have to schedule a meeting with you to understand that, because we have a project that maybe will be interested in your service. Let's see, with the solar PV. Yes.
Fantastic.
Thank you.
Okay, guys, thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much, Finnbar. That was really, really interesting.
No worries at all.
Thanks,
And I look forward to the next one in the series. Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you, Finnbar. Thank you, Christina. Also, thank you.
Thanks.
Have a good day, everybody.
You too. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.
Thanks, Arnold.
Yeah, thanks, Finnbar. That was really good. Really enjoyed it.
Okay.
Seems
Glad
to
to
have some connection problem today. It's funny, but
no problem. It happens all the time. I'm just getting another call, Arnold. So we'll see you at the next one.
I will share your video and your presentation.
Bye.
Okay. All right. Thanks, Christina.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.